The first time I heard the name Ouranopithecus, I thought it sounded like a creature from a comic book. Like one of those ancient monsters or forgotten gods with too many syllables in their name. But it wasn't a monster. It was real. A creature that lived around 9 million years ago. And even though it's extinct, it might hold the key to who we are. To who I am. Who you are. And where it all began. It all started when I found this old documentary playing in the background at my uncle's place. He's one of those people who always has either classical music or some kind of weird history thing playing. Normally I'd tune it out, but this time, the word ancestor made my ears perk up. The narrator talked about an ancient ape found in Greece. Not Africa, Greece. That got me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. An ancient ape in Europe? Isn't Africa the place where we're all supposed to come from? That's what school taught us, out of Africa theory and all. So, what was this Ouranopithecus doing over there, so far from the savannas and rainforests of Central Africa? Turns out, Ouranopithecus lived in what is now northern Greece and maybe parts of Macedonia. Back then, it wasn't all seaside towns and old ruins. It was a forested land with rivers and rolling hills, teeming with creatures. The world was a different place, halfway between what we know as apes and what would one day be us humans. I started digging. Not like real digging, I'm just a kid with a laptop, but the internet kind. And what I found was this weird mix of mystery, science, and imagination. Ouranopithecus was discovered in the 1970s, mostly from jawbones and teeth. That's how it often goes with ancient primates. No fancy full skeletons, just fragments of what used to be. But teeth, they tell stories. The scientists could tell that Ouranopithecus had strong jaws, huge molars, and thick enamel. That usually means a tough diet, maybe roots, seeds, even bark. You'd need powerful jaws to chew through that stuff all day. It was about the size of a large chimpanzee or maybe a gorilla, but it didn't quite walk like them. Some people think it might have been partially upright. Not fully human-like, not yet, but not fully ape, either. And that's where the mystery gets deeper. Was Ouranopithecus just another extinct ape? Or was it something more? Was it one of our ancestors? Now that question, wow. It messes with everything. Because if this ape in Europe was an ancestor of humans, that means the human story might have started there, not Africa. It could mean our roots are tangled in more places than we thought. That's a huge deal in science. Changing the starting point of humanity? It's like saying the first spark that would one day become a spaceship or a smartphone happened under the trees of the Balkans instead of the African plains. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The thing is, Ouranopithecus isn't alone. There were other ancient apes around at the time. In Africa, there was Ouranopithecus. In Turkey, Ouranopithecus. In Spain, Dryopithecus. It was like a whole network of primates stretching across Europe, Asia, and Africa during the Miocene, this long stretch of time between about 23 and 5 million years ago. The Miocene was kind of the golden age of apes. You'd walk through a forest back then, if you were somehow time traveling, of course, and see all kinds of different apes swinging, climbing, grunting, and living their lives. And somewhere in that mix, the first beings who'd become hominins, our branch, were beginning to stir. What makes Ouranopithecus stand out is its weird mix of traits. Some features look gorilla-like, especially the jaw. But other parts, like the structure of the face and teeth, kind of resemble early humans. It's like this creature was standing at a fork in the evolutionary road. One way leads to apes. The other way, maybe, just maybe, leads to us. There's a debate among scientists. Some think Ouranopithecus is a distant cousin, not a direct ancestor. Others argue that it could be a European hominin, a pre-human that later migrated into Africa and gave rise to the human line. Imagine that, a prehistoric journey into Africa, not out of it. That's a huge flip in the story we've always been told. But here's the thing. Fossils are rare. Like, really rare. Every discovery is like finding a puzzle piece in the dark. And most of the time, the pieces are broken, bent, or from entirely different puzzles. That's why people argue so much in paleoanthropology. Not because they're stubborn, okay, some of them are, but because the evidence is so fragile. One new discovery can change everything. I remember watching this one clip of a paleontologist talking about finding a tooth, just a single molar, and how it sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Imagine that. A chunk of enamel and dentin, smaller than your thumb, and it could rewrite what we think we know about human origins. It's kind of amazing, really. How something so small can mean so much. And maybe that's what I love most about stories like this. They make you realize how little we know. How much mystery there still is in the world and under it. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine what it would have been like to walk through those Miocene forests. To see Ouranopithecus climbing through the trees or crouching by a stream, jaws working on some tough plant, eyes watching the sky. It wouldn't know it was special. It wouldn't know that millions of years later, a kid in the 21st century would be wondering if it was part of his origin story. But I'd like to think that in some strange way, it is part of mine. Maybe not directly, maybe not through DNA or anything like that. But through curiosity. Through the way it sparked my imagination. So now, whenever I see a jawbone in a museum or read about an old fossil discovery, I don't just see bones. I see stories. I see possibilities. And I wonder, what if Ouranopithecus really was the beginning of something? Not just for scientists to argue over, but for all of us to imagine. There's something strange about old bones. Not scary strange, more like magical. You look at them and think, that's just a rock now. But it used to be alive. Breathing, moving, eating, maybe even thinking in its own way. And if that fossil is from something like Ouranopithecus, then you're not just looking at some long dead animal. You're staring into the face of your own ancient past. After I got obsessed with Ouranopithecus, I started asking all these questions. Some of them didn't have answers. But some did, and they led me even deeper into a mystery that's been going on for more than 100 years. See, the fossil record isn't like a book you can read straight through. It's like a bunch of torn up pages scattered across millions of years, buried under dirt and rock, waiting for someone to notice. And that's what happened in 1974, in a rocky part of northern Greece called the Chalkidiki Peninsula. That's where they found the first pieces of Ouranopithecus. Just a jawbone at first. Big, thick, and old. Not human, but not quite like modern apes either. And it came from a layer of earth that dated back around 9 million years. Think about that. 9 million. That's more than 30 times older than the pyramids of Egypt. That's before humans, before Neanderthals, even before Lucy, the famous Australopithecus who walked upright in Africa about 3 million years ago. This was another era completely. Back when Europe was warm and lush, filled with forests and rivers instead of cities and ruins. Now, here's the cool part. The scientists gave the fossil the name Ouranopithecus macedonensis, which roughly means heavenly ape from Macedonia. Sounds fancy, but it just shows where it was found. They've only discovered a few fossils so far, some teeth, parts of the jaw, bits of the face. But those were enough to raise some big questions. One of the first clues came from the teeth. I know it sounds boring, but teeth are like time capsules. They tell you what an animal ate, how it chewed, even a little bit about how it lived. Ouranopithecus had huge molars, with really thick enamel, thicker than most apes today. That means it was probably grinding tough foods. Not soft fruit or leaves like a chimpanzee. More like nuts, seeds, or maybe fibrous roots. It also had a strong jaw and flat face, not the long snout of a typical monkey. Its face looked more like early hominins than apes. That really got scientists excited. Because in evolution, the shape of the jaw and face matters. It tells us a lot about where that species sits on the family tree. And the more they looked, the more the puzzle grew. Some features matched gorillas' big, heavy jaw, for example. But others were closer to humans. It was like Ouranopithecus was caught in the middle of two worlds. Too advanced to be a basic ape. Too primitive to be a full hominin. A mystery stuck in time. The thing is, up until recently, most scientists believed that all human ancestors came from Africa. That's what the out of Africa theory says, that hominins, that's the group that includes humans and our direct ancestors, evolved in Africa, and then later spread out to the rest of the world. But Ouranopithecus throws a wrench in that idea. Because if this creature lived in Europe, and if it was closely related to hominins, then maybe the earliest spark of humanity didn't happen in Africa at all. Maybe it started in Europe and only later moved south into Africa. That's a pretty big deal. Now, I want to be clear. This idea doesn't replace the African origins theory completely. It just adds a twist. A fork in the road. Because some scientists now think that ancient apes, what they call pre-hominins, might have evolved in Europe or the Eastern Mediterranean, and then migrated into Africa around 7 or 6 million years ago. One of those scientists is a paleoanthropologist named David Begun. He's one of the people who studied Ouranopithecus closely. He believes this creature, along with some other ancient apes like Dryopithecus and Graphopithecus, could be part of a European lineage that later gave rise to early humans. He even wrote something wild, that we shouldn't ask did humans evolve in Africa, but instead ask where did the ancestors of the African apes come from. Because if they came from Europe first, then that changes everything. The funny part is, most people outside of scientists haven't even heard of Ouranopithecus. Everyone knows about Lucy, and maybe even Artie, another ancient ancestor from Africa. But this toothy ape from Greece? It's like a forgotten chapter of our origin story. One that's just now being dusted off. As I kept researching, I found another important piece. The age of the fossils. Ouranopithecus is about 8.7 to 9.6 million years old. That's older than most known early hominins from Africa. In fact, the first African hominins we know about, like Sahelanthropus chodensis and Ororantogennensis, are only about 6 to 7 million years old. So wait, if Ouranopithecus came before them, and it shares some of the same traits, could it be the ancestor of those African hominins? That's the question that haunts the scientists. It's not just about bones and dates. It's about migration, climate change, survival. There's a theory that, around 8 million years ago, the climate in Europe started to cool down. Forests shrank. Food became scarce. Maybe some of these apes, including the ancestors of Ouranopithecus, migrated south to find better conditions. And where did they go? Africa. Once there, they could have evolved further. Into Australopithecus. Into Homo habilis. Into Homo erectus. and, eventually, into us. It's a theory, not a proven fact. But it's fascinating. Because it means that the story of human evolution might not be about one place. Maybe it's a story that spans continents. A dance between forests and deserts, rivers and mountains, from Greece to Ethiopia and back again. I remember writing that down in my notebook. Maybe our story didn't start in Africa, maybe it started with an ape who climbed trees in the hills of ancient Greece. It felt strange, writing that. Almost like rewriting the history book. But science is like that, it changes when new evidence comes along. That's not a bad thing. That's what makes it exciting. It's not about being right. It's about looking deeper. And honestly, I hope they find more fossils of Ouranopithecus someday. Maybe a leg bone. A pelvis. Something that shows how it moved. Because if it walked upright even a little, then that could be the biggest clue yet. For now, we only have fragments. Teeth. Jaws. Bits of the past. But those pieces matter. They whisper to us through time. They say, look closer. Sometimes I stare at the drawings scientists make of Ouranopithecus and think, what did your world look like? Like, really, what did it smell like, sound like, feel like under your feet? What did this creature see when it opened its eyes each morning? I mean, yeah, I've never been to ancient Greece, but I've seen pictures. It's all dusty hills and olive trees today. But back then, millions of years ago, it was something else. A forested world. Thick canopies of trees. Rivers that cut through the land like silver ribbons. A warm, humid climate that made everything grow wild and fast. It wasn't like the Africa we imagine with lions and zebras. It was its own thing. And Ouranopithecus lived right in the middle of it all. But here's what haunts me, this ape didn't last. One day it was there chewing leaves, maybe climbing trees or watching other animals go by, and then, over time, it was just gone. No dramatic dinosaur-style extinction, no comet or volcano, at least, not that we know of. Just slow changes. Shifts in climate. A few degrees cooler. A few forests disappearing. Less food. More competition. And just like that, the heavenly ape of Greece vanished from the earth. But before we talk about why it disappeared, let me back up for a second, because to understand what happened to Ouranopithecus, we have to look at the time it lived in. Welcome to the late Miocene. The Miocene epoch lasted from about 23 to 5 million years ago, and it's when things really started to get interesting in primate evolution. Early in the Miocene, apes exploded in number and variety. There were dozens of species across Africa, Europe, and Asia, from giant tree dwellers to smaller, ground-based types. Scientists call it the golden age of apes. But the late Miocene, that's when things got tough. Around 10 million years ago, the Earth's climate began to cool. Slowly, year by year, century by century, forests began to shrink. Grasslands began to take over. That's a big deal when you're an animal that depends on trees for food and shelter. Ouranopithecus lived right in the middle of this shift, somewhere between 9.6 and 8.7 million years ago. It's almost poetic. It arrived on the scene just as the world was changing beneath its feet. Like a guest showing up to a party that was already winding down. And in Europe especially, those changes were dramatic. Once lush forests became patchy and dry. Plants disappeared. Rivers dried up. Animals that depended on fruit and leaves struggled. Apes, being tree-loving creatures, began to vanish from the European fossil record. By around 7 million years ago, they were basically gone from Europe. And that includes Ouranopithecus. But that leads to one of the biggest mysteries in this story: did it really go extinct? Or did it move? A quiet migration? Some scientists believe that Ouranopithecus, or maybe a close relative, might have escaped the environmental collapse by migrating south into what we now call Africa. Think about that for a second. That's the opposite of what we've been told our whole lives. We always hear that humans evolved in Africa and left later. But what if our ancient ancestor first evolved in Europe, and then entered Africa? If that's true, then the African apes, gorillas, chimps, and yes, us may all have roots that stretch back to Greece and Turkey. Our family tree might have started under the oaks of the Balkans, not just the acacia trees of East Africa. It's a bold idea. Not everyone agrees. But the evidence is interesting. Remember that ape I mentioned in part 2, Ouranopithecus? Well, it was found in Kenya and lived around 9.9 to 9.8 million years ago, very close in age to Ouranopithecus. In fact, some scientists think it might be the same species, or at least part of the same group that moved from Europe into Africa. It's like the clues are lining up, just waiting for the right connection. And guess what? There's more. The Mediterranean corridor. Back in the late Miocene, the geography of Europe and Africa was different. The Mediterranean Sea wasn't always the giant salty bathtub we know today. In fact, about 5.9 million years ago, the whole sea basically dried up for a while. It's called the Messinian salinity crisis. Rivers cut deep canyons. Salt flats stretched across what's now ocean. And scientists believe that before that happened, during the time of Ouranopithecus, there were already land bridges and shallow areas that connected southern Europe to northern Africa. So it wouldn't have been crazy for a population of apes desperate for food and forests to walk south, across these natural bridges, into the greener lands of Africa. I remember reading this article where a paleontologist described it like this: they weren't fleeing. They were following the trees. That stuck with me. Following the trees. Like a quiet retreat from a disappearing home. And maybe, just maybe, that migration is what led to the next big step in our evolution. Why it matters, you might be wondering. Okay, but why should we care? It's just some old ape that lived and died millions of years ago. But here's the thing. If Ouranopithecus really did migrate to Africa, it might be the common ancestor of all the great apes. That means gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans might all share a link that traces back to the hills of northern Greece. Imagine that. A small band of shaggy, powerful apes moving silently through forests, crossing valleys, heading into a new land they'd never seen before, just trying to survive. And that decision, that ancient journey, might have set everything in motion. Everything. Every cave painting. Every fire. Every invention. Every space rocket. Every song. Every word I'm writing right now. All because an ape long ago chased the trees south. So what happened to Ouranopithecus? The truth is, we don't know for sure. It's possible that Ouranopithecus didn't make it. That it did go extinct in Europe, and some related species carried on in Africa. Or maybe some of them did survive that journey and slowly became something more smarter, more upright, more tool-using, more curious. Until eventually, they weren't apes anymore. They were humans. But even if Ouranopithecus didn't survive, its story still matters. It's a window into a time of great change. A time when the Earth itself was shaping the path of evolution. And that's what gets me. We always think of evolution like this straight line, monkey to caveman to human. But it's not like that at all. It's messy. It zigs and zags. It depends on luck and on things like climate, food, geography, and time. Ouranopithecus was just one branch on the tree. But maybe, it was our branch. There's this moment in every detective story where the trail goes cold. Where you're staring at a clue, but there's nothing else around it. No footprints, no next step, just empty space. That's kind of what happened after Ouranopithecus. 1 minute, this ape was chewing through hard roots in the forests of northern Greece. And then silence. Not just for a few years. For millions of them. That's one of the weirdest, most frustrating parts of our origin story. There's this long, empty stretch, this gap between Ouranopithecus and the first true hominins. It's like the earth swallowed all the answers and left us with more questions than bones. But even though that silence is long, it's not forever. Because eventually, someone else shows up. Someone who walked. Enter, the first hominins after Ouranopithecus vanished from the fossil record somewhere around 8.7 million years ago. There's this huge gap. For almost 2 million years, we have very little fossil evidence from either Europe or Africa that tells us who came next. It's like trying to read a book that's missing 2 chapters in the middle. But then, around 7 million years ago, a new name appears, Sahelanthropus. It's not exactly easy to say. I had to practice it 5 times before I stopped sounding like I had marbles in my mouth. But it's important because this might be the earliest true hominin we've found so far. That means, the first creature that's no longer just an ape, but starting to become more like us. Sahelanthropus was discovered in Chad, in Central Africa. It's really old, like 6 to 7 million years. That's just about as old as you can get before we completely disappear into the mists of evolution. And when scientists found it in 2001, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It had a flat face, unlike a chimp. Thick brow ridges. And most interesting of all, its foramen magnum, that's the hole where your spine connects to your skull, was positioned in a way that suggests it may have walked upright. Let that sink in. An ape or almost ape walking on 2 feet. That's one of the biggest evolutionary steps ever taken. Why walking changed everything? Okay, I know walking doesn't sound super impressive. We all do it every day. I walk to school. I walk to the fridge. No big deal. But in evolutionary terms, walking upright, what scientists call bipedalism, was a huge deal. It changed everything. Standing on 2 feet frees up your hands. That means you can carry things. Pick things up. Maybe throw rocks or hold tools. It changes how you move, how you hunt, even how you communicate. Walking upright made it easier to spot predators across the grasslands. It helped early humans travel farther, share food, and eventually, build culture. It was the beginning of what made us human. And Sahelanthropus? It might have been the first to do it. But here's the twist, Sahelanthropus doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's a real possibility, though we can't prove it yet, that it might be connected to creatures like Ouranopithecus. It's like seeing 2 photos, one of a grandparent, and one of a grandchild. The faces are different, but there's a spark, a hint that they might share something in their DNA. The others who walked Sahelanthropus wasn't alone for long. After it came a few more fossil discoveries that help fill in the story. One Ouranopithecus, Kenya, discovered in 2000. Dated to about 6 million years ago. Scientists found femur bones, leg bones, and guess what? The shape suggests it walked upright too. Its nickname is actually Millennium Man, because it was found right at the turn of the year 2000. Ouran wasn't quite human, but it was definitely not just an ape either. It was evolving slowly into something new. To Ouranopithecus, Ethiopia. There are two types, Ouranopithecus kadaba, about 5.8 million years ago, and the more famous Ouranopithecus ramidus, about 4.4 million years ago. Arti is special because she gives us a much more complete picture. A partial skeleton was found including parts of the pelvis, feet, hands, and skull. That's rare. Like, super rare. What makes Arti fascinating is that she was both arboreal, tree climbing, and bipedal, walking. It's like evolution hadn't made up its mind yet. She could hang out in trees but also move on the ground. A real-life transition fossil. And that's what all these early hominins seem to be, transitions. They weren't human, but they weren't like chimps either. They were becoming something new. So, did they come from Ouranopithecus? That's the big question. Did these early African hominins Sahelanthropus, Ouran, Ouranopithecus descend from apes like Ouranopithecus who migrated to Africa? Here's what we know, timing. Ouranopithecus is older than all of these. So it's possible it came first. Geography. Back then, southern Europe and northern Africa were close. Maybe even connected by land. A migration would have been hard, but not impossible. Fossil similarities. Some features like the jaw shape and face are surprisingly similar between Ouranopithecus and Sahelanthropus. Not identical, but enough to make scientists say huh. That's interesting. So it's possible. It's not proven. But the pieces could fit. And honestly, I want them to. Because that would mean the story of human evolution isn't just the story of Africa. It's also the story of Europe. Of migration. Of change. Of survival. That's something I keep thinking about. Survival equals adaptation. Here's a cool thought, evolution isn't about strength or speed. It's about adaptation. The ones who survived were the ones who could change. Who could shift from tree branches to walking on the ground. From forests to open grasslands. From foraging to tools. From silence to language. Ouranopithecus adapted as long as it could, maybe even long enough to give rise to creatures like Sahelanthropus. And those hominins. They kept adapting. One step at a time. Literally. That's why bipedalism matters so much. It's the first real clue that someone was changing. That someone was heading toward a different kind of future. And that future would eventually lead to fire, to art, to space travel, and to me sitting here, writing all this in my notebook. All because, millions of years ago, someone walked when no one else did. By now, you might be thinking, walking on two legs was cool and all, but when did we really start to feel human? Like, not just walking upright or eating different foods but actually doing something clever. Something that sets us apart from every other creature on Earth. For me, that moment is this, when our ancestors picked up a rock. And instead of throwing it they shaped it. That's where we are now in the story. We've come a long way since Ouranopithecus was munching on tough forest plants in ancient Greece. That mysterious, jaw-heavy ape might have been one of the first links in our evolutionary chain, or maybe just a close cousin. But now the story shifts. We're in Africa, around 2.5 to 3 million years ago, and the air feels different. There's movement. Innovation. And for the first time, purpose. The rise of Homo habilis. The next major character in our story is Homo habilis, which literally means handy man. Pretty cool name, right? He was given that name because scientists believed he was the first hominin to use tools. Homo habilis lived in East Africa about 2.4 to 1.5 million years ago, way after Sahelanthropus and Ardipithecus. And what made him so exciting was that, unlike earlier hominins, his brain was noticeably larger. Not huge, not Einstein level or anything, but bigger than his ancestors. And here's where things start to change in a way that feels really, really familiar. Because when you look at Homo habilis, you're not just seeing a smart ape anymore. You're seeing the spark of something new. A creature that could make decisions, use tools, maybe even work with others. They weren't just surviving. They were thinking. The old Dowan tools now, don't picture a Swiss Army knife or a hammer just yet. The tools used by Homo habilis were simple, just sharp flakes of stone chipped off from larger rocks. But even though they look rough, they were a giant leap in human evolution. These tools are part of what scientists call the Old Dowan industry, named after the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania where many of them were found. What were they used for? Cutting meat off bones, breaking open marrow, scraping hides, maybe even digging for roots. For the first time, early humans weren't just reacting to nature. They were shaping it. Literally. Think about how huge that is. Animals use their bodies, claws, teeth, horns. But Homo habilis? He used his mind. He picked up something outside his body and turned it into a tool. That changed everything. But was Homo habilis really the first? Here's where things get interesting. For a long time, scientists believed Homo habilis was the first tool maker. That's why he got that name. But in the 2010s, researchers found stone tools in Kenya that were over 3.3 million years old, older than Homo habilis. Let me say that again, 3.3 million years old. Older than Homo habilis by almost a million years. So, who made those tools? Well, they weren't made by Homo habilis. They were probably made by an earlier hominin like Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as Lucy. Yeah, Lucy. That small, upright walking female who lived around 3.2 million years ago and became one of the most famous fossils ever found. She was bipedal, for sure. But now it looks like her kind might have also been using tools. Maybe even before Homo habilis was born. That changes the story completely. Tool use didn't start with humans. It started before us. What makes a tool maker? This is where the line between human and not human starts to blur. Because let's be honest, chimpanzees use sticks to fish termites out of holes. Birds drop rocks on nuts to crack them open. Even sea otters use stones to break shellfish. So what makes our ancestors different? Well, it's not just using a tool. It's making one. It's looking at a raw piece of the world, a rock, a branch, a bone, and thinking, I can shape this into something useful. That's design. That's planning. That's culture. Even those early old Dowan tools, basic as they were, show signs of deliberate crafting. Not just random hits, but repeated actions to get a specific shape. That's the beginning of technology. Why tools changed everything. Once our ancestors started using tools, everything accelerated. It's like a chain reaction. Better tools, rightward arrow, better hunting and gathering. They could cut meat faster, open bones for high energy marrow, and scrape hides for clothing or shelter. Better food, rightward arrow, bigger brains, more calories especially from meat and fat meant the brain had more fuel. And over time, brains started to grow. Homo habilis had a brain size of around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters. That's about 50% larger than Australopithecus. Bigger brains, rightward arrow, more complex behavior, more problem solving. More memory. Maybe even the beginnings of communication. More learning. Rightward arrow culture starts to form. Imagine kids watching adults make tools, copying them, improving them. That's teaching. That's learning. That's culture. All of this, from brain size to social behavior, starts to shift the moment we pick up that first sharp rock. That rock might be simple, but it's the symbol of something enormous. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were innovating. From hands to minds. I keep thinking about what it must have looked like. Picture it, a group of early humans gathered near a river. One of them, maybe the oldest, picks up a stone. They squat, strike it against another rock. A sharp flake falls off. They test the edge, then hand it to someone younger. That person mimics the motion. A child watches, wide-eyed. A pile of flakes grows. That scene probably happened thousands of years ago. But in a weird way, it's not that different from today. We still learn by watching. We still use tools. Only now they're made of plastic and metal, and they fit in our pockets and connect us to the entire world. But the spirit is the same. It started with stone. The legacy of handyman. So was Homo habilis our direct ancestor? Probably. But not everyone agrees. Some scientists think Australopithecus afarensis might have evolved directly into Homo erectus, instead skipping Homo habilis entirely. Others think Homo habilis was part of a branch that eventually led to us Homo sapiens through species like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis. But one thing is clear: once tools entered the picture, we were on a new path. A path no other creature had taken. The path that would eventually lead to language, fire, art, and civilization. And that's why Homo habilis matters. He wasn't just surviving in Africa. He was inventing the future. If you ever sit by a fire, like a real one, crackling in a forest or campsite, not just a fireplace or a barbecue grill, you start to get it. The heat. The sound of wood popping. The flicker of light dancing on faces. It feels ancient. Like it connects you to something older than memory. And that feeling? That connection? It might go all the way back to Homo erectus. That's the next chapter in our story. The chapter where things really start to feel human. Because after the walkers and the toolmakers, there came a time when our ancestors didn't just survive where they were born, they left. They traveled. They tamed fire. They changed the world. Meet Homo erectus. If Homo habilis was the handy man, then Homo erectus was the first real adventurer of our kind. He wasn't just a slightly smarter ape. He was something new. Something different.